Welcome back. Today I'll be bringing you my first cornerback ranking for the 2027 draft. If you do enjoy the content, please consider liking and subscribing as it would be very much appreciated. Now let's jump into it. At 10, I've got Ashton Hampton out of Clemson, and I've got a UDFA evaluation on him. At 6'2", 200 pounds, Ashton Hampton has a solid build with good length. He played plenty of man coverage and has enough fluidity when combined with his size to compete for his place on an NFL roster. But I felt really uninspired by him as a prospect. His speed is okay, but limited both in terms of burst and long speed. He doesn't look very natural in terms of tracking the ball and making a play. He's very hesitant to get his head down and defend the run. He consistently gives up too much cushion underneath in both zone and man coverage. So I don't know. This is a guy who is pretty high up draft boards, but Hampton's a former 3-star recruit. The stats aren't amazing, so I don't even know where the misleading overhype is coming from. I saw a player who was just kind of there on the Clemson defense, not a complete liability, but didn't do anything that looked like legit NFL cornerback play. As I mentioned, good size, fluidity isn't a total disaster, so he could compete for a roster spot. At 9, I've got Kelly Jones out of Mississippi State. Kelly Jones is being projected as a first-round talent by many early 2027 draft boards, and in my opinion, he's a classic case of how overhyped a prospect can get at any time in the draft process, never mind a year before. Jones was a 3-star safety when he committed to Mississippi State. He barely played in his first year. In his second year, he was a rotational starter and didn't show anything special, so it's unlikely that he would have been drafted off the back of those 2 years. And then suddenly, in year 3, something kind of extraordinary happened to his stats, specifically the reception percentage. When targeted, Jones gave up a 28.9 completion percentage, which not only led the FBS for anyone who took a significant amount of snaps, but led considerably, with second place on 35.9% and third place on 40%. I have to assume that almost every major big board that there is at this early stage is not being made up off of people watching film. It's stats and general trends. So with Jones having as dramatic an improvement in a key statistical area, it's no surprise his draft stock has risen just as dramatically. Here's what happened in reality. Jones did not budge in coverage. You could not break him with change of direction skills because he was not trying to predict your movement. He stayed right in the receiver's face, leaving him totally vulnerable to receivers attacking the space he left behind him. When they did, Mississippi State played low-hanging safeties that often covered up the initial space left by Jones before his long striding speed and length allowed him to catch up and try to make a play, which sometimes he did, but it's also pretty telling that his yards per reception given up was at 19.3 last year, the 5th highest of 153 cornerbacks. Jones is long, has good route anticipation, and good speed once he's into full stride. But any time I saw him forced to play outside of the narrow box he played in most of the year, he looks like an awkward, gangly defender who simply can't change direction or cover short distances with the efficiency required to hold down a starting spot in the NFL. At 8, I've got OJ Frederick Jr. out of Miami, and I've got a day 2/day 3 evaluation on him. OJ Frederick was a standout freshman in 2024 as he quickly cemented himself with a role on the outside, holding receivers to a 36.8 completion percentage. 2025, however, has thrown a bit of a spanner into the works, as after week 9, he picked up an arm injury, which meant he missed 4 games before going on to pick up a non-contact leg injury during their playoff game versus Ohio State, which left his leg in a boot. The injuries are a concern, and from a selfish perspective, I was frustrated to see him fight through injury towards the end of the season because despite Miami being a major program, he had never really faced a big-time receiver in his career, and then he gets injured and isn't at his full capability for the matchups against Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate, Omar Cooper Jr., Elijah Surratt, and Casey Concepcion. Anyway, Frederick is listed at 6 foot flat, 185 pounds, although I'm a little skeptical about the mass because his age is unknown as far as I can tell. PFF have decided to not list his weight for the time being, which I don't think I've ever seen before, so details on the player are a little bit hazy, I think he's probably around 190 to 195 pounds. He sports an athletic, well-toned frame, similar to Keontae Scott, another cornerback who's just been drafted out of Miami. Frederic has a springiness about him. There's a vibrance to his movement. He is explosive, fast over long distances, and reads the game well. Whether it's feel for zone, route recognition, picking up on a run play, he seems very switched on. I definitely feel there's a tightness in the ankles. He tries to get close to his receiver, commit his hips, and force the opponent in the direction he is facing in order to compensate. But when this doesn't work, and he has to operate a bit more open-chested and match the receiver with pure footwork, it looks pretty clunky, which is why I would have liked to see him against a Carnell Tate or a Casey Concepcion, who I feel would have made this a bit more apparent. I also think he lacks length, because despite getting his eyes up and seemingly doing a good job locating the ball, he got out-leveraged by his opponent in contested catch situations pretty frequently. The lack of length makes me think he could be more of a nickel, and I would quite like him there. My only hesitance would be that you have to play quite open in the slot because you're in the middle of the field, so the stiffness could be problematic, but in a zone-heavy scheme, I could see him being really useful in this role, clogging up the short region with his understanding of where to be, having the route recognition to not keep being turned inside out by more flexible, agile slot receivers, the speed to run with a quick receiver running a slant route, and just him being around the line of scrimmage could be half his value with his athletic traits and his ability to read the run. So I project him being at his best in the slot, and if he has a healthier 2026 season, I think he's got the athletic traits and the intelligence to be a useful starter. At 7, I've got Zabian Brown out of Alabama. Zabian Brown is a former 5-star recruit and has proven to be a reliable starter for the Crimson Tide. Brown is a safe prospect. He definitely lacks speed and isn't the sharpest when changing direction, and this caps his ceiling. I don't see him ever being the lockdown island corner you draft with a top 10 pick. However, in a zone-heavy league, there are plenty of NFL teams where Brown walks in and quickly cements himself in a starting spot. His arms look enormous on his 6-foot frame that is well filled out, carrying 194 pounds. And the biggest compliment I can give to Brown is how much film I had to watch in order to see the flaws in his movement. His route recognition is outstanding, as is the body control. Clearly, he's somewhat aware of his limitations and generally makes up for it with his ability to recognize route patterns and the quarterback's eyes before demonstrating a huge amount of trust in his ability to do so, as he breaks on what he thinks is happening super early. So I feel he's a reliable starter in a zone-heavy scheme. At 6, I've got Chris Peel out of Syracuse, and I've got a day 2 evaluation on him. Chris Peel is the epitome of a low-floor, high-upside prospect. In theory, he's got the ability to be a shutdown island cornerback in the NFL. At 6'1", 200 pounds, he's well filled out and appears to have sufficient length. Peel is explosive, he's got long speed, and I've seen him change direction well enough to stick to the likes of TJ Moore of Clemson, one of the best route runners in this receiver class. And actually similar to TJ Moore, and I guess why he matched up pretty well with him, the control over his speed is really impressive. Laterally, Peel can be a little bit stiff. I would say it's more shifty than fluid, but he makes it work. It's just a little bit clunky at times. And in terms of the stop-start ability, he looks really sharp. So that's definitely a first-round physical profile. What's the issue? Well, his first 2 years in college were spent with Georgia. Not that you would have known it, as he missed the whole first season with turf toe and most of his second year with a torn labrum. He then transferred to Syracuse last off-season, and despite a minor undisclosed upper body injury in spring practice, he finally played a full season. For all of his ability though, he was not a good cornerback last year. First of all, his back pedal was all over the place. I've got a feeling it's to do with the way he's being coached, because unlike a lot of colleges, especially nowadays, who just ask their DBs to stay square and keep the receiver in front of them, I read that Syracuse are pretty adamant about coaching their DBs to do the opposite. Basically, open up immediately, commit to where you think the receiver is going, and trust that you have the fluidity to make an exaggerated turn if you get it wrong. Well, Peel just looked totally out of sync a lot of the time. He gave up way too much cushion underneath, he overcommitted his hips, He turned his back to the receiver when changing direction far too often, and actually there was a mental lag in terms of when to close the space. Weirdly enough, there were flashes in zone where he looked really on it, didn't just sit back and stay rigidly planted in the middle of his zonal assignment, but actually recognised what was happening based on the quarterback's eyes and the way the play was unfolding, and tried to do something about it. So there's something in there if you can tap into whatever mental space that is, but apart from those flashes, and they were just flashes, he seemed to step behind. He's a very reliable tackler, but again, even in the run game, just didn't show the play recognition to have an impact. So an injury-trodden career so far, and a lot of refinement required even in basic areas like the back pedal, as discussed. If he gets another serious injury or shows no development in his early NFL career, he's going to struggle to hold down his place as a starter. However, if he stays healthy and even demonstrates the small jump in technique that you would expect to see in his second year playing significant college snaps, it's going to be hard to ignore the fact that he's got legit traits, and I'll probably be pushing his evaluation towards first round, maybe even top 10 pick territory if he really pulls it all together. At 5, and getting into my first round/second round evaluations, I've got Ellis Robinson IV out of Georgia. Ellis Robinson was not only a 5-star coming out, but the second highest ranked player in the 2024 recruitment rankings, behind only Jeremiah Smith. And it's easy to see why. His arms reportedly measure in a shade under 33 inches, which gives him borderline elite length and far exceeds the measurements you would expect, given the fact he's listed at just 6 foot flat. He also appears to me as someone who could run in the 4.3s at the combine. He can open up and run deep with a Cam Coleman or a Ryan Coleman-Williams, but he's also twitchy and can cover short distances very quickly. So length and speed for a cornerback is always going to get scouts excited, but he's actually missing the trait that I look for in a corner more than anything: fluidity. Robinson plays a decent variety of coverage for Georgia, including a good amount of press man. He does a good job keeping his hands to himself and displays strong route recognition, meaning a lot of the time he looks fine. A really tidy, long, fast cornerback, no problem staying on top of his receiver. But when he doesn't quite pick up on his receiver's route, gets caught off guard, and has to flip his hips and change direction, it's super stiff. In fact, the first time I saw it, I wondered if he just lost his footing, because for an 180-pound guy as highly recruited as him, I was quite taken aback by how uncomfortable he looked in this situation. But then I saw it again and again and again. With this said, he mostly gets away with it in college, and the truth is, he can get away with it in the NFL. The way the rules are now, cornerbacks can't get physical with the receivers. To put them on an island and say, cover the best receiver on their team, not only do you not know where he's going, but you also can't lay a finger on him. There's a handful of guys who can do it, and I still value the guys who can do it more because it's more difficult to do. But it also makes sense that teams are running less press man coverage than ever. It's all about having guys who can keep their distance right up until the ball is coming their way, and then have the speed and the instincts to close and make a play. I think with his length, his route recognition, and his speed, the Vic Fangio defense that most of the league seems to be running now fits Robinson perfectly, and he won't have to bulk up too much from his 180 pounds because he won't be asked to get physical with the receivers. I actually thought his instincts in zone were quite poor. He kept selling deep, even though he had free safety help, and then he would give up a chunk underneath where he should have been. But he's basically only been playing for one of his 2 seasons, and even then, that season was heavily rotated in the Georgia secondary, so he's got time to learn. The other thing is that he suffered a high ankle sprain and an MCL sprain in this year's spring practice, but has already reportedly recovered, suggesting that these were grade 1 tears and are probably not the end of the world. So, Robinson is an off-man coverage corner with the speed and length to become a solid starter. At 4, I've got Bryce Pollock out of Texas Tech. After 2 years with Mississippi State, Bryce Pollock transferred to Texas Tech and had a huge year, maintaining a 35.7 NFL passer rating when targeted, third lowest of 153 cornerbacks. Interestingly though, I believe he achieved this in a defensive scheme that doesn't accentuate the things that he does best. Texas Tech run a zone-heavy scheme, or typically a hybrid known as match zone, where the coverage starts as zone and transitions into man. I think Pollock is a press man cornerback. He's listed at 6 foot flat, 195 pounds, and appears to have sufficient length. He's not super fast, but has enough long speed and good burst. He's physical, but not overly so, and pulled in 5 interceptions last year. These interceptions didn't just fall into his lap either. He's got legit ball skills. Another reason him being in press man is useful is him being closer to the line of scrimmage for run defense, because his ability to get off blocks and locate the runner is excellent, and his tackling is very reliable. On top of all of this, I thought his lateral fluidity was really impressive. Pollock is an interesting case though, because generally speaking, lateral fluidity and linear fluidity go hand in hand, at least to some extent. You get guys who thrive at one or the other, but usually a fluid mover is a fluid mover. For whatever reason, Pollock seems very agile laterally, but there's a clear problem with his ability to stick his foot in the ground and pounce forward out of his back pedal. Now, it's hard to tell how much of this is to do with his physical ability and how much is a mental lag. I think a bit of both. He does seem late to trigger and start closing the space when required, but he also looks pretty clunky when doing so. Unfortunately for him entering the league in the era he is, it's pretty clear to me that you don't want him trying to manage space, dictate distance. You want him up close and personal with the receiver from the moment the ball is snapped. I think he can get away with playing zone coverage when required, although he really is going to have to work on his discipline and not leave the team totally vulnerable with him being completely out of place. But simple zone coverages where you are basically just sitting in your zone, most DBs can do that. It's really just off-man heavy coverages I want him to avoid, because those are the ones that require a sudden break out of the back pedal. So a team that plays a weird blend of simple zone and aggressive press man would be perfect. It doesn't really exist, as the two kind of contradict stylistically, but at a certain point, you accept that he may not be perfect for the zone side of things, because he'll be fine. The whole point of playing zone is that it's safe. It doesn't expose the DBs too much, whereas the sticky press man coverage that Pollock could provide is rare, and for a team that values this, could make him a solid CB1 for a franchise. At 3, and getting into my true first round evaluations, I've got Jamari Sharp out of Indiana. Jamari Sharp is a really solid prospect. He doesn't do anything to blow me away, but does everything well enough to be a reliable starter from the moment he enters the league. Indiana run one of the most zone-heavy defenses in college football. In fact, it's even more conservative than your standard cover 2, as the cornerbacks drop almost as deep as the safeties a lot of the time and play quarters. This isn't ideal in terms of trying to figure out how fluid one of their cornerbacks are, because everything is played in front of them. But having watched Sharp, as well as D'Angelo Pons, who played on the same team and just came out for the 2026 draft, I've gained an appreciation for how well Indiana coach their cornerbacks. Sharp is very disciplined. He's rarely out of place and appears to see the full picture with the way he drifts into the right space time and time again. I wouldn't mind him being a bit more aggressive to trust his eyes and clamp down on the receiver a bit more, but I think this partly goes back to the way they're asking him to play. He's also a very reliable tackler, and I think more scheme versatile than you might assume. At 6'1", 187 pounds, Sharp is a bit of a lightweight, but he also feels that way with his movement. I think he's got decent long speed, but I was particularly impressed with his quickness over short areas. I also think he's pretty fluid. Maybe not to an elite level, but definitely seems to have a skill set that would make him capable of surviving in tight man coverage. As I've mentioned, there's nothing that really jumps off the screen about Sharp, but the instincts and the discipline make him effective in zone. The quickness and the route anticipation would make him effective in off-man, and I think he has enough fluidity and long speed to make him effective in press man. To me, he just feels like someone who could walk onto any of the 32 defenses and cement himself as a starter. At 2, I've got Jair Hill out of Michigan. Due to an August birthday and a fast-tracked enrollment into college, Jair Hill will be just 20 years old by the time of the 2027 draft, despite going into his 4th year in college this season. And how much difference being a year or two younger really makes, I don't know, but he does feel that way as a prospect. First of all, he's 6'2", 190 pounds, so a good frame, but could do with bulking up a little bit. He is a fiery competitor, seems like he could be a little bit overly excitable based on his aggressive nature on the field. His tackling technique is woeful. The pursuit angles are poor, he doesn't wrap up. In fact, sometimes he doesn't even try to wrap up and goes for the armless Superman tackle, which is shockingly common in college, even though it makes no sense to try and tackle someone like that. But there's something about Hill that just makes me a bit nervous. Ball skills are not a strength of his. He seems kind of uncoordinated when the ball is coming his way. He's often overly aggressive and awkward with his technique in trying to jam his receiver, which, especially with his lack of physicality, can make him vulnerable in these moments. Another thing that I found really frustrating is that he gave up so many yards to the same route and did so in the same way over and over and over again, and that's the slant route. I don't know what it is. He just has not figured out that when his receiver breaks into a slant, it's time to clamp down. He kind of tries to run stride for stride with his receiver after the break, but do so whilst maintaining a linear gap that doesn't need to be there anymore. Kind of bizarre. So it's an accumulation of all of these little flaws that just make me slightly uncomfortable about him. And yet, he checks all the major boxes. Hill plays a ton of zone, as I've mentioned, and because he can be so erratic in other areas, I was kind of waiting to be able to jot down that he doesn't have the zonal instincts, doesn't see the full picture, but I don't think that's true. I thought he displayed a good understanding of where he should be on paper, and something that I think is just as important in zone. He was brave enough to rip up the paper on occasion because he has that real-time feel for the game and knows that sometimes the pre-snap coverage just isn't suitable anymore for the offensive play design. Someone on the field has to see that and intervene, which is what he tries to do. So I don't want to paint this guy as an idiot. He's clearly switched on enough to recognize certain patterns in the game, and physically it's all there. He's long, he's fast, especially over long distances, but in short areas as well. And the small sample size of man coverage meant I had to dig through a decent amount of film to see it, but I think he's really fluid as well. I believe this is a top 15 caliber of outside cornerback in the making. One that will probably always have the occasional bad moment, a missed tackle, a mental lapse in coverage, a misjudgment of when to be physical against a bigger receiver. But with the right coaching and the right culture, Hill can be the best cornerback on plenty of teams and can also be scheme flexible. At 1, I've got Leonard Moore out of Notre Dame. Leonard Moore came out as a 3-star recruit, but has far surpassed that expected value, cited by the likes of Jeremiah Smith and Elijah Surratt as the toughest matchup in their careers so far. As 6'2", 195 pounds, and reportedly 32-inch arms, Moore is a bit skinnier than you would like, but the frame is there for a prototypical outside corner build. And one thing that always makes my job easier when evaluating cornerbacks is a situation like Moore's. Notre Dame run one of the most man-heavy defensive schemes in college football, meaning I got to see Moore left on an island and attempt to run step for step with some of the best receivers in football. The results were spectacular. I mostly watched his 2024 film as he dealt with a high ankle sprain last season, and a lot of his toughest matchups were in 2024 anyway. The physicality of Jeremiah Smith was a real test for Moore, given that he is a little bit skinny, but Moore kept him limited on his side of the field, conceding just 2 receptions for 14 yards. Moore is a real fighter. He is handsy, but finds the balance of disrupting the receiver's route without crossing the line and picking up flags, and he stays on the front foot from the moment the ball is snapped, which he can only do because his movement skills are elite. He trusts himself to stay square, stay in the receiver's face, and not get caught flat-footed, even against the likes of Makai Lemon, Omar Cooper Jr., or one of my favourite receivers in last year's draft, Zachariah Branch. The matchup with Branch was enormously helpful from an evaluation perspective because yes, Moore has the size advantage, and they didn't line up one-on-one every snap, but when they did, Moore continued to display excellent fluidity and good speed. Speed being the biggest question mark when I was watching Moore, because he's so good at keeping the receiver in front of him that his speed was rarely tested, but against Branch, he was forced to open up, and he's not as explosive as Branch, but he was right on his tail. Moore also displays great ball skills. His length, hand-eye coordination, and anticipation has allowed him to thrive when it comes to reaching around the receiver and breaking up the pass before it's got to him. And the cherry on top is the fact that he held on to a few last season, recording a very impressive 5 interceptions. His zonal instincts are a bit untested, as he was seemingly always in some sort of man coverage, and even the zone coverage is often match zone coverage, where there is still a loose man coverage assignment in most instances. But I was really impressed with his ability to read the run. The tackling technique is not great, but the play recognition and the aggression is, which will be enough for him to not be a liability in this area. So, I would love to see him bulk up a little bit and hopefully not lose too much speed or fluidity. The ankle sprain last season did pop up in the spring practice this year as a minor issue, although it's probably just the team being cautious. And what Moore has is something that is rare, which is that he ticks the 3 boxes: length, speed, and fluidity. This doesn't come around in every draft, so assuming he's healthy, he should be one of the first names off the board next year. So early thoughts on this class based on the 10 that I've watched. Well, I'm coming off the back of a receiver video where I had 8 first rounders from the 13 guys that I looked at. This isn't quite the same, but Leonard Moore is an elite cornerback prospect. Jair Hill has the traits to become an elite cornerback. So those are the 2 for me. Then you have a bit of a drop-off, in my opinion, to Jamari Sharp, who doesn't have that same upside, but is very scheme flexible and pro-ready. Before that next few, where it becomes a more philosophical conversation. Press man is where a cornerback can be exposed. It requires high-end traits that are rare, so surely you value that more. But then if everyone is playing zone coverage anyway, should we be just leaning into that and valuing zone coverage skill sets higher? I don't think there is a clear answer, but whichever way you spin it, teams are playing much more as a unit. They're not relying on their cornerback to cover the best receiver on an island, which is why I just don't value cornerback as a premium position anymore, the way I do with edge or tackle, for example. In fact, last year I had 2 first-round cornerbacks and 2 first-round safeties, which I thought was an outlier, but we'll soon find out as I'll be bringing you safeties next. So if you did enjoy the content, please consider liking and subscribing, as it would be very much appreciated, and I'll see you next time.